Among chessmen and books, Lucani prefers to mix his classic gin tonics. Meet one of the inspiring voices of the English antique industry who believes in the analog values as well as the new technology. Some told me that you are a connoisseur when it comes to gin.
My favourite gin is probably Tanqueray. I think, I'll tell you why I'm interested in it. So my father was an advertising executive in the 1960s and in London, here in London. And he used to advertise a rather wonderful old gin called Booths, which alas is, I don't think it certainly doesn't exist in England. It may still exist in America, and it was a very famous old gin. And so I was brought up in a house where people were obsessed with gin, and our whole house was a temple to gin. My father had a sort of drinks tray full of Booths gin, bottles of Booths gin, and they made a very famous London dry called High and Dry, which was used in dry martini cocktails in the 1960s and 70s. So it's very much in my DNA. And I sort of got into it recently. I'm also very into the packaging, so I'm very interested, but maybe we'll talk about this later. I'm very interested in graphics and graphic design and labels and things like that. So I'm especially interested in the old gins. But yeah, no, Tanqueray would be the one that I would, if say we were going to make a dry martini cocktail with gin, but we could perhaps talk about this later. Tanqueray is the one that I would go for.
What would your father say about that then? Because
well, I think he would agree.
That gin is not existing anymore.
Yeah, I think he would agree with me because you know, Booths obviously doesn't exist in England. If it did, I would be having that.
Yeah.
Particularly the High and Dry. But I think what I'm really getting at is that there's been this massive sort of hipster gin revival, which is great. It's a fantastic thing. It's partly because the government lowered the requirements to start a distillery. So all these macro distilleries are set up. And if you go into a supermarket now, there are thousands of, exaggeration, hundreds of gins, but they're all rather sort of botanical and people experimenting with different flavors. And so I've rather sort of reacted and gone back to the original concept of a juniper-led gin. And actually I like the older, more old-fashioned brands like Beefeater or Tanqueray or whatever, which are really all about juniper rather than adding all these trendy flavors.
So how should a perfect gin drink be drank according to you?
Well, yeah, this is very interesting. I mean, do you drink gin? Can I ask how you?
No, I like it.
How do you have it?
Well, but I drink most gin, either gin tonic or as you say, like a dry.
Well, I think the two ways. You've got the American way, which is the dry martini, which I think was invented in the sort of 1910s. It's certainly in America. And then you've got the very English drink, gin and tonic. If I'm going to make a dry martini, I would certainly not do what Bond did, which is shake it and stir. I mean, Fleming. I love Fleming's books, by the way. I actually prefer the books to the films. He got a lot of things wrong. So gin needs to be stirred in a pitcher with ice, with a bit of vermouth, like Noy Pratt, and then poured out into a very, very cold tumbler, maybe with a bit of lemon or lemon peel or whatever. And that's your classic dry martini. When it comes to gin and tonic, again, there have been huge advances in tonic making in England over the last 10 years, and there's some wonderful brands which are made out of all sorts of mineral waters and pure waters and things, which are delicious. And the drink originally was a colonial drink, and it was brought in for people, I think, in India who might have got or were about to get malaria. So the whole point was that people would drink it with quinine to stop getting malaria. And that's where it comes from. So yes, a classic gin and tonic, I actually prefer it with a slice of lime rather than lemon on the rocks with one of those Ponzi tonics you can buy now. And that's an incredibly nice drink. But
how important is the tonic for it, actually?
Well, I think the tonic's really important because the problem is that there is a brand that I won't mention, but a very famous brand of tonic has got an awful lot of sugar in it. And what's interesting about these new types of tonic water is that they're going back to the 1930s, and it's much more how tonic would have been drunk in the 1930s. And since the 1960s and 70s, this really famous brand with the yellow label has got more and more sugar in it. So I think what they're trying to do is get back to the original concept. So I think it's incredibly important. So if you're going to put in a very expensive hipster gin that you've paid an arm and a leg for, you want to use a really high quality tonic water. I mean, nothing wrong with the standard stuff, but I just like the purity of the waters they're using and less saccharin and less sugar in it.
You add the sugar through the lime instead.
Yeah, I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
How important is the surrounding when you have a great gin tonic, for example?
So if we should go back to the dry martini, which should be made in a pitcher. I thought it'd be quite fun. You can. I'm very keen on Harrods Bar in Venice, which a lot of tourists go to, and people tend to sort of say it's a tourist trap and everything. But it's still a wonderful place. And if you go in there and you're very polite and they treat you back very well, you're not a tourist, you go in wearing a suit and you're not going in wearing a shell suit or something, you'll be treated very, very well. The first dry martini I ever had there was, I was about, how old was I, 19 or something? And it was served in incredibly small little tumblers, which I actually prefer, I think, to the classic martini glass.
I think they still are serving that glasses, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They're tiny little tumblers with the famous Harrods Bar logo, and they keep them in the fridge. So they take them out ice cold, and then they stir it in a Harrods Bar pitcher. Now, if you go onto eBay, you can buy a Harrods Bar pitcher, and there are quite a few of them. I was actually quite tempted. I mean, I think they probably sold them to people in the tourists who went there in the 1960s and 70s. But if you go onto eBay and type in Harrods Bar martini pitcher, you should be able to buy one at reasonable cost. So that would be quite a fun thing to use. And I'm also quite like the idea of one of those L'Itala frosted tumblers, tapioca curlers, the wonderful glass little tumblers which look like they're made from ice. So I think a dry martini, one of those would be quite fun.
But you mentioned a pitcher on eBay, but what is needed in terms of items to make the drink a perfect experience?
Well, it's a very simple thing, and I think simplicity is what it's all about, isn't it? So you need ice, which I suppose if you're going to be an absolute purist, you make out of mineral water rather than tap water. And you need a pitcher, and then you need a spoon to stir it in. So you put the Noye Prat into the ice, and then you shake it off so that the ice is clinging with the vermouth. Then you add your gin neat. You stir it round, pour it out into a very, very cold tumbler, which you've kept in the fridge. And then you add possibly an olive, perhaps, or possibly a twist of lemon peel. And that's it. But you don't. There's a trend at the moment to serve it on the rocks, I think. I'm not sure I approve of that. I mean, it's a wonderful, simple, and cold. It needs to be incredibly cold because that's what changes the whole taste of the gin. But what you don't want to do is what Fleming suggested, is that you shake it in a cocktail shaker, like a Bloody Mary or something. You don't want to do that.
I was actually more thinking about how important is the items in terms of, like, does it have to be antiques? Does it make the experience better? Or do you understand what I mean?
Well, I think that's taking it to extremes, isn't it? It depends how much how in you are to it. So what you think the idea of serving it up in like antique glasses? Well, I don't know. I just think serve it up in small tumblers is a really important thing. And I suppose the Harrods Bar pitcher is not exactly an antique, but you can certainly have one from the 1950s. But whether that actually affects the taste is probably doubtful.
You consider yourself as an amateur chef. Do you stop at an amateur because you have too many drinks before the meal?
I'm just being realistic.
Or does it depend? So your humble attitude, or
yes, I'm just being realistic. Sometimes you do something and it's bloody good, and other things. I made something the other night for my wife. It was a total disaster. Yes, no, I did. I started. So when I started the writing, I wrote this. I still do. I started writing a food and, sounds horribly pretentious, culture blog called The Greasy Spoon. And I started that in 2006 when people weren't really blogging. And I'd go to a cocktail party and chat up a girl or something, and I'd say, I'm a blogger. And they would look at you with sort of horror. They're like, this is a really nerdy thing to do. But now, of course, they're all doing it themselves. And then, so I had the last laugh. So that's when I got into food. And my mother also had a business in the 70s doing sort of dinner parties and things. So I was always quite interested watching her cook, and I sort of really got into it. And I started collecting cookery books and Yes, an amateur is very much the
right
way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, enough about your alcohol habits. You're also a dedicated chess player.
Well, no, I'm lousy. I'm a dreadful chess player.
Okay, but you play.
I can.
And
play.
you collect.
No, I don't. No, I don't. I'm a dealer in chess sets.
Yeah.
Because when I started my auction career at the old Bonhams, excuse me, down in off King's Road, and then I moved to Phillips Auctioneers, became a European Works of Art specialist. And one of the things that they sort of gave me to fail with when you're a junior specialist is do the chess sets. And sort of luckily or unluckily for me, the first chess sale I did, I came across a East India John Company set, which is incredibly rare, made about £15,000 for an incomplete set. So then I sort of never looked back. So I've been doing that for years. But I'm not a collector. The only chess set I've got is a rather interesting Indian Islamic set, which is rather beautiful. And I deliberately keep it at one set. And am I a chess player? Well, I can play, but I was beaten by a 6-year-old, so that tells you. But Backgammon is actually the game that I really like.
Is that something you're also collecting and sell?
Well, I'd be very interested to talk about the difference. I mean, it's interesting because there are obsessive collectors of chess sets. I mean, there really are. All around the world, people who are absolutely just obsessed with them. Backgammon tends to be bought, it's a different market, so backgammon tends to be bought by people who, so rather urbane people who want a beautiful backgammon set for their library, or they want a backgammon set to give us a present. But I've yet to come across anybody who actually collects backgammon sets in any great quantity.
What is the most interesting chess map?
Well, the whole market has changed because in this country an ivory ban is about to be introduced in the next few days, literally. So up until about 3 or 4 years ago, the most expensive chess sets were made from ivory. So now that we have a ban in the UK, and I think the EU probably will follow at some point. The ban first came in America as well, about, when was it? 8-9 years ago, something like that. So it's completely changed the market. So what we're now looking at is wooden sets and bone sets. And when we're talking about wooden chess sets, we need to talk about the Jake Staunton set, which is the classic tournament pattern. And these sets are now rising in value. And they're, as I always say to people, they're design classics in their own right. And you probably, I mean, do you know the sort of sets I mean? The classic set you see in chess tournaments with the knight's head is based on the Elgin marbles.
Well, what about, we're talking about the interest for it, but what about the prices? I mean, what does an antique...
Well, a standard 3.5-inch Jakes from about 1890, I'd sell for about £1,500.
And where's the market? Is it globally or?
Completely global. Americans, well, actually what's interesting about the Staunton sets, they tend to be collected more by the English-speaking world. So, and that's because they are a classic English design. So we're talking about America, huge in America. Australia now, I'm finding the Australian market's much stronger than it was. England, obviously. The Staunton sets are less popular in Europe, and that's partly because they have their own patterns. There's a pattern called the Silenus pattern, which I don't know if you know, is a very popular pattern during the Biedermeier period in Central Europe. And it's the sort of thing you see in cafes in Vienna and places like that. Munich, Bavaria, into Eastern Europe. So each country, a bit like playing cards, has its different pattern.
In one of our latest reports on Barnaby's, we can see that the searches for board games has really increased.
Yes.
Is this a trend you see as well?
Yeah, I do. I'm really pleased about that. It's fantastic that all these sort of young people, kids in their sort of 20s, are really into board games. And I've started sort of watching some of these people on YouTube who it's huge. And there are all these sort of, I don't know how old they are, people in their early 20s maybe, who are suddenly really into board games, and they all sit around and they play. And you go into shops now, go into any bookshop now, and you'll start seeing there's a proper board game section. So, no, absolutely. I think it's great. It's an analogue reaction to the digital, without any doubt.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about human interaction.
No, it's true. Also in the report, we see, for example, that collecting in general has increased tremendously in younger audience for stamps, coins, those kind of things.
Well, coins at the moment, as you know, is huge.
Yeah.
Whiskey is another example, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just something you can get your fingers burnt on, so you really do need to know what you're doing.
How does actually, I mean, as you said, whiskey has increased enormously.
Oh, crazy, yeah.
What about gin, for example? Will that...
Well, that's a really nice thing. Actually, I've just written a big article feature for Homes and Antiques magazine exactly on this. It's interesting because, yes, if one of the beauties about buying gin at auctions, say, you can buy a bottle, and I'd be very interested in buying a bottle of booze gin, one of my father's booze gins from the 1960s, at auction, and you get a little bit of evaporation, but it will essentially taste the same as when it goes in the bottle. And there are some people who actually think that it actually does develop in time, because they tended to use, so I was talking to an expert about this when I researched my article, they tended to use sort of much purer ingredients in that period and less chemicals, which means that the spirit, although technically it's not supposed to improve over time, there are people who think that it can improve over time. So, but again, if you're buying old gin, which is not a huge market like whiskey, it's still very, very affordable. I mean, I'd also buy it because I just love the packaging. I was really, really interested in the graphics, and some of those old labels are really beautiful. Like the old Martini label was. Yeah. Do you remember? You're too young to remember that.
No, I remember. But also, I lived in Italy, and they're still on
wonderful.
The walls and some.
Yeah, I mean the old Martini label from the 1970s, which I think they got rid of in the 90s. Why did they get rid of it? It was the most wonderful bit of graphics, and I just don't know. I don't understand sometimes why these things happen.
Now they become collectibles. That's
it.
That's a nice part of it.
Yes.
So in one of your latest blog posts on your blog, The Greasy Spoon, you comment on your comeback on the blog after about a year break with the words, "The problem with blowing Alice is that you might spend 2 days writing what you think is a brilliantly witty feature, and then receive only one comment from a Nigerian gentleman recommending the benefits of Viagra, perhaps, or a California robot flogging something called Bitcoin."
Yes, that's right.
So you turn into Instagram instead. Is it better?
Yes. Well, yes and no. It's such an interesting thing. I absolutely love Instagram.
What's the beauty of it?
Well, is it because it's immediate? I think it's because it's immediate. I mean, I've met so many really quite influential, interesting people through Instagram, who I've then gone on and actually met in real life as well, and we've become great friends. I think it's because it's immediate. I don't know. Blogging, when I started, blogging was a huge thing. I think blogging, I mean, I still don't want to stop doing Greasy Spoon because it was a baby and it was my baby, and I don't want to throw it away with the bathwater. But it somehow is less immediate than Instagram. And I think the thing about Instagram is that people can respond immediately to it. Well, perhaps with a blogging post, you've got to go and write a comment and then post that comment, and then somebody's got to think, well, with Instagram, it's a much smoother. I mean, you're the tech specialist. I don't know why you think. It's also very visual. So, but what I do, I think actually maybe that's key, isn't it? It's visual, while blogging is more literary. But what I do is I put up an interesting photograph, and then I write about the photograph. So I'm quite literary on Instagram, and I actually write proper articles and features on Instagram. But I suppose the lead is actually the picture. That comes first, and then the writing. But I find the two work together very, very well as a medium.
So where did your interest for antiques and collectibles start?
Well, my grandfather. So my mother's family were quite a well-known furniture manufacturer called Parker Knoll, which is a very famous company in England, and they were massive antique collectors. So my grandfather was a very stylish man, and he was very interested in modern design, but he also was collecting antiques as well. And they had a beautiful house, which I sort of grew up with. So I've always been really, really into it from a very, very early age. And I was a trustee until recently of the Frederick Parker chair collection, which was originally my great-great-grandfather's collection of antique chairs. So it's always been in the blood. And I think you either get it or you don't. But in recent weeks, I've started becoming much more interested in modern design and partly through the writing, and then I'm very interested in the idea of combining both. So because at the end of the day, all the same things apply to whether you're collecting Jacobin furniture or whether you're collecting old cars or whether you're collecting coins. The same principles apply. Or if you're collecting old board games, the same principles apply to antiques. It's all about rarity, it's about condition, it's about supply and demand.
And what we call modern design is actually starts getting antiques too.
Well, it's not really modern, is it? Or modernist design, 20th century design, I suppose. But I've got very interested recently in 1970s design, particularly in Italy and places like that.
There was such a strong market at the time.
It's your sort of thing. It's your sort of thing, isn't it? But it's just really, really interesting, and I think I like the idea of combining it with antiques, perhaps, rather than just having what I don't like is when people are purists. So you have a room which is everything has to be Regency, or everything has to be Victorian, or everything has to be. It's much more fun to actually develop an eye and select things that you think are interesting and see if they work together. I think that's more exciting in some
more
ways.
About the quality aspect.
Yeah, the quality of it. And again, I've just written a big feature for Homes and Antiques about this. So when you collect something, it's much more important to focus on the quality than the quantity. And when I used to be an auction valuer, I'd go to people's houses, and the moment you walked through the door, you knew whether they had a good eye or not. And you meet somebody with a terrific eye who may have 20 superb objects of very high value. Or you might go to somebody's house where it's absolutely cluttered with stuff, and everything is worth very little, and is actually not really very interesting. It might be old, but it might, So I think that's something to think about when you're collecting.
Yeah. And you started as an auctioneer, working for auction houses.
Well, I started originally as a porter. That was the way in those days. So I got a job. Originally, I wanted to be a publisher, and I couldn't get into publishing. So I then started in desperation as a van driver and a porter at the old Bonhams in Chelsea, and that was the old Bonhams before it was taken over. And then I moved to Phillips in Bond Street and became a porter there. Then I became a junior specialist on the counter, which was an interesting experience. So people would come into the auction house, and you would ring a bell with their stuff, and you would go out and you would have to give an on-the-spot valuation. And then I moved on there and became head of valuations at the Phillips branch in Bayswater, then did auctions in America as well, Phillips New York and Freeman's in Philadelphia. And then I worked for Bloomsbury Rare Book Auctions, which I loved. Because I'm very, very interested in books, and something I collect. It's like a disease. So I expanded the games auctions at Bloomsbury, and we got into old backgammon sets and gambling equipment and old playing cards and antiquarian books, and the auctions did very, very well there.
Books is another category that is a huge interest for you right now.
I absolutely love books. I'm really obsessed. I'm really. We've got 4,500 at home. It's just insane. Yeah.
But just first editions, or?
Well, not. Yes, I've got a lot. I'm very into 20th century English first editions. Graham Greene, Anthony Pearl, writers like that, and American Truman Capote, people like that. So I really got into that. And I just collect across the board. I got I'm very interested in history, so I've got a huge collection of books about 19th century European history. And we work at the moment, we have a sort of dining room stroke library where my computer is set up in, and it's just insane. And I've got books piled up to the ceiling. I put shots on Instagram, and people you can barely see my head sticking out from behind the pile of there's so many books.
But isn't that beautiful? I love it. I think.
But it's tactile. They're beautiful, aren't they? Because the other thing I think is so brilliant. Again, I love YouTube. I love YouTube, and seeing all these sort of younger people in their 20s who are just really into the books, and they're collecting Folio Society and things like that, or whatever they're collecting, or they're collecting Barnes and Noble leather editions, and they're showing. And you've got these sort of girls showing you their collection of Jane Eyre. It's absolutely, I love it. Along with their board games, I think it's absolutely brilliant. So they've gone. The Kindle hasn't won. So we're going back to love the old books and the smell. And the other thing also I'm really into, because I had an unhappy spell working as a bookseller when I was trying to get into publishing, but it was sort of quite useful because I learned quite a lot about books. but the production values of modern books, because they're made in China, and I think the quality of Chinese printing is extreme and design extremely good. The Chinese are brilliant copyists, and the prices have come right down. But the quality of books now, if you go into, we're talking here in just off Piccadilly, if you go into Hatchard's very famous bookshop, go into the children's department and look at the quality of the children's illustrated books, it's fantastic. So I think we're in a golden age of publishing.
Quality is back.
Despite the internet, but in many ways that's helped, I think.
No, exactly. I think that's the interesting thing. Also, with the auction market as a whole, that the internet actually helped the market to grow. Yeah. When people were super afraid of technique coming into the market, but it's actually helped in many ways, didn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, you see, there are people who I absolutely love Amazon, and I use Amazon a lot, and I have huge wish lists and things. And I'll be unpopular for saying that. There are a lot of people who say they hate Amazon, they're putting small bookshops out of business, and that is true to some extent. But at the same time, Amazon is also helping publishers selling books. And I think actually currently, I may be wrong, but I think there are more books now being published, I think, than ever before. So, but the prices in this country have come right down. So the books in England at the moment are particularly cheap. Yes, I think that's true, and I think that what's interesting about the future is that if you went back to the 1960s, and I love old science fiction films, and you look at futuristic films, and everybody is walking around in sort of silver foil suits and driving, Stanley Kubrick and stuff, and it's not like that. Actually, what's happened is that although we have this digital world, the analogue has sort of come back and is now working side by side with, so people get into collecting vinyl. So you'll have a vinyl person who's selling vinyl, but they're selling it online.
Yeah.
Which they wouldn't have been able to have done before. So I think the two can work side by side. And it's the same also with the auction. I mean, we talk about prices, which maybe we could talk about it later on, but when this sort of thing started online, I was initially very concerned that the difference between a dealer's price and an auction price, that anybody can go and research something online.
Yeah, transparency was...
But I don't think that really matters, actually, because it doesn't seem to have affected... I don't think it really has made much difference. I think, again, use that word transparent. It is transparent, and people realise that if you're a dealer, that you need to make a profit, and you're also selling a guaranteed, and you are putting your visual eye and your experience, your expertise into selling something which an auction house might not necessarily do. So. And there are some people I know who will only buy from a dealer rather than an auction house.
What about you working for auction houses or yourself as a dealer?
Yeah.
What's the benefit? What's the pros and cons?
Well, they're two quite different things. The first thing, when I left, I was an auction specialist in cataloguing, an auctioneer, and then became a dealer. So when I left, the first thing that I had to get my head around was the pricing, which is completely, utterly different. So if you're an auctioneer working for a upmarket auction house like Sotheby's or Bonhams or Christie's or whatever, you will tend to, somebody comes in with an object, you look at it, you've seen plenty of them before, and you put an auction estimate of £2,000 to £3,000 on it. And that is a sensible auction estimate based on years of results. And you can, if necessary, you can go away and check the prices, and you'll see that this is what these items have consistently sold for over the last 3 or 4 years. If you're a dealer, the prices are all over the place. So there will be dealers who don't really know, in the case of the chess set, who don't really know what they're doing, who will maybe offering it online for far too low price. There may be other dealers online on eBay asking with a buy it now price with crazy amounts of money. Or again, there might be a dealer in Beverly Hills with a huge markup, which may or may not be justified. So that's the first thing you need to get your head around, is that the pricing is just all over the place, very, very different approach. So I was a very steep learning curve with that one. So I learned pretty quickly how to, and you also need to identify where you are in the market. So I see myself as what I would call an upper middle market. I'm in the upper middle market. I'm not in that very top market. I work online. I'm a specialist dealer working online. I don't have a shop in Bond Street, but I see myself as an upper middle of the market, and I set my prices according to that. But the other problem you have also with auctions, of course, is that with collectors' areas like chess, you as a dealer, you're also competing against the collectors, your own collectors, your own clients, who will come into the auction and will buy the price at auction for something approaching what you may sell it. So many dealers feel they're being squeezed out of markets. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an expert in maps, and he was saying the same thing, that it's becoming increasingly hard to buy at auction because of the savvy collectors are coming in and buying, treating auction houses almost like retail, and they're buying and they're paying the sort of prices that you would charge. So it then makes it very difficult for the dealer to buy at auction, which is why actually that most of the chess sets that I sell are on commission for other collectors rather than actually sets that I buy at auction. But I buy other antiques at auction, so it really depends on which market you're in.